Hi class, this is video 1 of your Chapter 2 on Culture. Altogether there will be 5 videos covering this material. So first we begin by asking ourselves, what is a society, and is our class considered a society? So the basic definition of society is that it is people who interact in a defined territory and share a culture. Now, you see a little graphic depiction there that illustrates the relationship between people, society, culture, and environment. The idea that it's like those Russian nesting dolls. They're all nesting inside of one another. And then the time arrows is just meant to indicate that all of this can change over time. So culture and societies are fluid. They're not fixed. They don't remain the same. Another way we can define society is by looking at the criteria that one must meet in order for it to be considered a society. So first of all, it needs to be a fairly large number of people, although in today's world, what that means is very different than what a fairly large number of people would have meant back during hunting and gathering times. They need to live in the same territory, and this is so that they can regularly interact and be interdependent upon one another. They need to be relatively independent of people outside of it. So if the rest of the world was to be swept away or develop a flu, would your society be able to sustain itself? Would it be able to meet its basic needs without being reliant on other societies? That is a criteria that it must meet in order to be considered one. And then finally, societies participate in a common culture. Doesn't mean that everyone agrees with all the cultural elements or enjoys all the cultural elements, but that they are at least aware and that enough people at least participate. So if we look at this criteria, our class isn't a society for a variety of reasons. First of all, even if I combined all of my classes, we maybe are just still not a large enough group in order to meet that large number of people. However, even if there were thousands of us, then we still would run up against the fact that, according to that third bullet point, we are not relatively independent of people outside of our class society. You know, we don't necessarily make our own food. We don't regulate our own trade. We would not have the capabilities to be self-sustaining. So we are part of the larger American society, and therefore we do participate in a common culture, but we ourselves do not have a class society and a class culture. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's now really hone in on what this chapter is about, which is culture. Culture is all the ways of thinking, ways of acting, and material objects that together form a people's way of life. Is socially constructed, which means people create it. And because people create it, that means that they can constantly change it, which we do. Whether you're talking about things you can touch, like food, art, drama, music, or things that you can't touch, like beliefs, language, behavior, rituals. All of those things are what culture is comprised of. Now, a couple of just quick points to make before we delve more deeply into American culture is that cultures vary across space. So even right now in 2019, the American culture and our beliefs and attitudes and material objects might be different than what you would find in Germany or India or Japan or Chile or Canada. And you see an example of that in the graph, the chart right there, when looking at attitudes, for instance. So the percentage of people that have a negative attitude towards homosexuality, you can see that there is a difference between places like Germany and the United States versus India or Iraq. And that is because culture, including cultural attitudes and beliefs, they vary. However, cultures also change over time. So if I wanted to even just show how American attitudes have changed from 2019 versus 2009 versus 1982 versus 1963 versus 1928 on a topic. We wouldn't expect that people's attitudes would necessarily remain the same, even if the society itself, American society, is the same, because what that society looked like varies over time. So when we're talking about American culture for the next slides and the next set of slides actually for the whole chapter, and then when you're thinking about American culture to do your writing assignment or your extra credit, I am giving you a specific place, America, but then also contemporary America. So, what is going on right now in American culture, contemporary culture, in regards to our material objects or our values or our beliefs. Now, how exactly do we get the culture that we have? Well, your book focuses primarily on one, diffusion, but I would like for you to also be aware of two other ways in which a society can get culture, starting with the more rare way of getting culture, which is discovery. And that's because when you discover something, it is already there. It exists in the environment, and then people just discover it. Like if you've ever been to Reed's Gold Mine, like the discovery of gold in America, or when we discover a new star, planet, or a new form of animal. That is what's meant by discovery. And for culture, especially at this point in our kind of, time history, timeline, this isn't really a very common way in which people get culture. Instead, invention is much more common. And this is where humans create elements of culture using existing elements that already are available within society. Invention is much more common than discovery. And I don't want you to think about invention in terms of just actual like inventions or the arts, movies and music and so forth. But also invention can be, the creation of a gesture or slang or even just a developing new attitude towards something. All of that counts as, in fact, an invention. And the final way that a society gets culture, which is the one that your book goes over, is diffusion. And diffusion, or to diffuse, means to spread. So in this case, we're interested in how culture can spread from other societies into different societies. So diffusion has become much more common in a society like ours where you have technology, especially new technology and social media kind of dominating the scene, because now it's a lot more easy for us to spread our cultural artifacts or our cultural beliefs to other societies. And the picture that I show there of those golden arches, Mickey D's, in multiple languages just shows that comparative to maybe 50 years ago and definitely 100 years ago, more and more elements of our society, American society, is popping up in other countries' culture. So we are becoming more alike than different. And that is a concept that your book discusses called cultural leveling. And when you think about cultural leveling, there can be some real advantages, but there also can be some real disadvantages, as some elements of what made other societies' cultures unique are becoming lost, and as they're being replaced by, we all wear blue jeans and Nikes, and we eat at McDonald's and we drink Starbucks coffee. We all partake in a lot of the same media, whether it's hip hop music or Marvel movies. Certainly, there is a positive there as we develop like this shared global culture, but that does mean other elements that made other societies' cultures unique are becoming lost. Their traditional dress or their traditional music styles or just their traditional ways of life. But diffusion has become a way in which that cultures get or societies get culture from other societies, and it's become much more common. For the rest of this presentation and for the presentations going forward, we're going to do a deep dive into American culture. And part of this requires you to be maybe more reflective and analytical than you usually are about American culture. And this is because, as your book notes, culture represents taken for granted orientations to life. We often don't think too deeply about why we feel what we feel or why we value what we value, because we've been raised to just see it as normal and right. But part of being a cultural analyst, which I'm asking you to do to a certain extent in both your written assignment and your extra credit assignment, is picking at those taking for granted orientations to life. Noticing the water, even though, as your book points out in that Ralph Linton quote, the last thing a fish would ever notice would be water. Well, I am asking you to notice it and to pay attention to it. And to encourage you to notice it, I'm going to be giving you some specific vocabulary to help make sense out of our cultural components. Beginning with the basic division of cultural components into material versus non-material culture. So if culture is all the shared products of human groups, material culture is the actual physical objects, concrete objects that people create and use. Everything from our food to our clothes to our buildings to our technology that we use, all of that is material culture. Non-material culture is the abstract, non-physical human creations. This would be language, gestures, attitudes, beliefs, values, behaviors. All of those things make up non-material culture. Now, before I go a little bit more deeply into those two types of culture, let's talk about the relationship between the two. So, they are intertwined so that some elements of our material culture have significance because of our non-material cultural elements. So take something like the American flag. The flag itself is just a piece of cloth with a specific design, but it is embedded with the values of patriotism, freedom, equality, whatever primary American values you believe exist. So that's what gives it meaning. You can think of something similar for things like the cross, if you are a believer of the Christian faith, or a wedding ring, and what makes that ring on that specific finger significant is because of our value of monogamy, or our belief that marriage is meant to be forever. So there are certainly some elements of material culture that are meaningful only because of the non-material cultural elements attached to it. The other way that there can be a relationship between the two is through the concept of culture lag, which your book does go over. Sometimes we have the ability to create things, physical things in our culture, but we aren't sure how to feel about those things, or whether or not we should create those things because our non-material cultural beliefs and values haven't caught up with our ability to create those things as of yet. That was a tongue twister. But basically what I'm saying here is sometimes we know how to do something, create something. Artificial intelligence, allowing people to select specific traits in their human embryos. So what people sometimes call designer babies. The fact that we have technology that allows people to age up and age down, and although we generally use it to age people up to help with missing person cases, we could also do things like age people down and create more or less child pornography without using real children. Whether you're thinking about artificial intelligence, designer babies, computer-assisted child pornography, The fact that we can create all those things is material culture. But how do we feel about those things? And do those things challenge important American values or beliefs? Well, that is a non material cultural concern. And to the extent that we don't do any of those things, maybe as much as we have the ability to do those things, it is reflecting the fact that we aren't sure what we believe about it or if this is problematic from a value standpoint. And this is what culture lag is, that our beliefs and values have not necessarily caught up with something that exists in a material, concrete way in our society as of yet. So, what about those material cultural elements? Well, they can be split into two types. There are artifacts and there's technology. So, artifacts are those material objects, those physical human creations that exist within society. Everything from the food we eat to the buildings that we build, to our art, whether it's music or physical art or movies. It's the clothes that we wear, the shoes that are on our feet. All of that is what is considered to be an artifact. That little graphic that you see just gives you some examples of some kind of common American artifacts, things that some people associate with America. You know, hamburgers, hot dogs, movies, the bald eagle, football, cowboys. And normally, this is pretty straightforward for most students to understand. This is the element of culture that is easily visible and that we interact with on a regular basis without really thinking about what these artifacts might symbolize or suggest about our society. The second type of material culture can be a little confusing because when I say technology, you may not be thinking society's tools or the knowledge that people use to make a way of life in their surroundings, which is the definition of technology. You might be thinking specifically of things like the internet or artificial intelligence or the microchip. And because some of those things are not really physical, like we can't touch them in the most literal sense of the word touch, students don't always necessarily think that this is a form of material culture. But if you think about the internet just being a newfangled version of the printing press or the steam engine or the plow, any of the previous forms of technology that have existed at earlier times in society, then maybe it makes sense that although technology has now moved into what we call new technology, it is still considered to be a form of material culture. And that's it for part one. Please open up the part two video where I will be discussing the non-material culture aspects of society.